My grandmother kept a small tin box under her bed for 63 years. Inside it, 4 buttons, a piece of waxed string, a folded paper bag that had been reused so many times it was soft as cloth, and 3 rubber bands so old they crumbled when my cousin finally touched them in 1987. She wasn't hoarding. She was doing what every American family did during the Great Depression, treating ordinary objects with a reverence that modern people can barely imagine. Between 1929 and 1939, unemployment hit 25%. Families lost farms that had been in their names for generations. Children went to school wearing flour sack dresses. Men sold apples on street corners for a nickel just to keep their families from starving. And in the middle of all that pain, 20 specific items became the backbone of daily survival. Objects so practical, so essential, so deeply woven into the fabric of American life that people couldn't imagine living without them. Today, most people under 40 have never touched a single one. Some have never even heard the names. We found 20 of them. A few will surprise you. One of them, number 1 on our list, was something almost every American home still had as recently as 1965, but you'd be hard-pressed to find today. If you were born before 1955, you probably used it yourself. Make sure you're subscribed before we start. Old-timers, we need your memories in the comments. Let's go back. Number 20 is the icebox card. Not the icebox itself, though we'll get to that, but the specific cardboard sign that every Depression-era household kept in the front window. It was a square card divided into 4 quadrants, each printed with a number: 25, 50, 75, and 100. These numbers represented pounds of ice. When the Iceman came down the street with his horse-drawn wagon, the family would rotate the card so the number they needed faced upward. He'd see it from the road, know exactly how much to bring in, and chip off the right block from the larger slab in his wagon. The Iceman never had to knock. No words needed to be exchanged. It was a perfect, silent system of communication between working people who had no time to waste. These cards were printed by ice companies as advertisements. Drink pure crystal ice, Union Ice Company, delivered daily. And families kept them for years. Today you could search every antique market in America and be lucky to find 3. Most were thrown out the moment the electric refrigerator arrived. The Iceman's trade died so fast that men who'd had steady roots for 20 years found themselves unemployed almost overnight. Number 19 is the denim overall bib pocket. Not the overalls themselves, those still exist, but the specific, painstaking culture around the bib pocket and what families put inside it. During the Depression, the bib pocket of a man's overalls was essentially his wallet, his office, and his filing cabinet. Men kept their work orders folded in quarters. They kept pencil stubs so short they barely fit between 2 fingers. They kept tobacco, aspirin wrapped in wax paper, a folded letter from a relative, a lucky coin from their father. Women sewed hidden reinforcement stitches around the inside of bib pockets because the fabric wore through and the things inside could not be replaced. There was an entire unspoken etiquette. You never reached into another man's bib pocket. You never asked what was in it. A man's bib pocket was private in the same way his thoughts were private. Denim overalls still exist, of course, and the bib pocket is still there. But the culture, the meaning, the absolute dependence on that small square of fabric as a container for everything that mattered, that died with the Depression generation. Number 18 is the penny postcard. I know what you're thinking. Postcards still exist. But the Depression-era penny postcard was something categorically different. In the 1930s, when a phone call cost more than most families could casually spend, the penny postcard was how Americans communicated. Not just vacation greetings, everything. Men sent penny postcards to employers asking about work. Women sent them to relatives 3 states away to say the baby had arrived safely. Families sent them to notify distant kin about deaths, marriages, illnesses. The cards were plain white with a single red line dividing the back in half. Message on the left, address on the right. People wrote in handwriting so small and precise it takes a magnifying glass to read today. They learned to say everything in 4 lines because that was all the space they had. Leave a comment below. Did your grandparents send penny postcards? We want to know. Whole family correspondences from the Depression survive today only because those tiny white cards were tucked in Bibles and wooden boxes for safekeeping. Every word on them was chosen carefully because every word cost effort and every penny counted. Number 17 is the coal scuttle. American homes heated by coal, which included the overwhelming majority of urban homes in the 1930s, needed a coal scuttle in every room with a stove or furnace grate. A coal scuttle was a heavy metal bucket, usually cast iron or galvanized tin, with a wide lip for pouring and a short handle. Families would buy coal by the ton in autumn when prices were low, store it in a basement bin or a pile against the house, and carry scuttlefuls upstairs throughout the winter. The physical labor involved was considerable. Coal is dense, the scuttles were heavy, and a cold night could require multiple trips. Coal dust got into everything: curtains, lungs, the cracks between floorboards. Depression families who couldn't afford coal burned anything that would light: scrap lumber, old furniture, corn cobs, paper compressed into tight rolls. The coal scuttle sat beside every stove as a matter of survival. When natural gas heat and central heating spread through American homes after World War II, coal scuttles disappeared within a single decade. Most were thrown in the trash. The few that survived were repurposed as planters or fireplace accessories by people who'd forgotten what real cold meant. Number 16 is the flour sack. Not the flour itself, the actual cotton bag it came in. During the Depression, 100 pounds of flour arrived in a cotton muslin sack roughly the size of a pillowcase. Nothing was wasted. Mothers washed the sacks, boiled out the ink printing, and sewed them into dresses, shirts, underwear, curtains, dishcloths, and quilts. Feed companies and flour mills eventually caught on and started printing their sacks in flower patterns and cheerful colors specifically because they knew Depression mothers would sew them into children's clothing. It was a form of compassionate commerce. There are photographs of Depression-era school classes where half the girls are wearing dresses made from the same cheerful calico print because the whole community had bought the same brand of flour that month. Flour sack quilts from the 1930s survive in museums and private collections, and they are extraordinarily beautiful. Intricate patchwork made from 20 or 30 different sacks, each representing a different month's baking, a different store's inventory. The flour sack itself vanished when paper and then plastic packaging replaced cloth. The last cloth flour sack left most American kitchens sometime in the early 1960s. Number 15 is the Wringer washing machine. Every Depression home that had any kind of washing machine at all had a Wringer machine, and most families still did laundry by hand even then. The Wringer machine was a metal tub on legs, with an electric or hand-cranked motor that agitated the clothes in soapy water. The clothes then had to be fed, piece by piece, through two rubber rollers pressed tightly together, the wringer, which squeezed out most of the water before the clothes went onto the line. The wringer was simultaneously useful and dangerous. Every woman who used one regularly had a story about fingers getting pulled in. Children were forbidden to touch it. Rings, buttons, and belt buckles could damage the rollers or snap back painfully. And yet the wringer machine was considered a luxury. Families would out one boiled clothes in a wash pot over an outdoor fire and wrung them by hand, which left knuckles cracked and bleeding in winter. The automatic washing machine, with its self-contained spin cycle, made the wringer machine obsolete almost overnight when it became affordable in the 1950s. If you grew up using one of these, drop a comment below. We want to hear about it. Number 14 is the tin bread box. Before plastic bags, before commercial sliced bread in its sealed wrapper, before refrigerators were standard in every home, the bread box was how American families kept their homemade loaves from going stale too fast. Depression-era bread boxes were typically made of tin or enameled metal, roughly the size of a small microwave, with a roll-up or lift-off lid. They sat on the kitchen counter as a fixture as permanent as the stove itself. A fresh loaf went in the bread box the moment it came out of the oven. The metal regulated temperature and kept out flies and mice. Bread baked on Monday was expected to last through Wednesday. By Thursday, what was left went into bread pudding, breadcrumbs, or toast. Nothing was discarded. The bread box wasn't just a container. It was a symbol of domestic management. A woman who kept a good bread box was a woman who ran a tight kitchen. The plastic bag, the commercial bakery, and the refrigerator together killed the bread box. You still see them occasionally in antique stores, sometimes repainted in cheerful colors, sold as farmhouse kitchen decor by people who have no idea they're looking at an artifact of genuine survival. Number 13 is the rag bag. Every Depression household kept a rag bag, usually a cotton sack hung inside a closet or on a peg near the kitchen door. Into the rag bag went every piece of fabric that was too worn to patch, too small to reuse as a garment, too thin to be useful as a dishcloth. Strips of old wool blankets, the remnants of a shirt worn through at the elbows, the border of a sheet that had been cut down to make a smaller sheet and then cut down again. The rag bag was not a garbage bin, it was a materials inventory. Rags were used for cleaning, no paper towels, for stuffing patchwork items, for weaving into rag rugs, for wrapping around pipes in winter to prevent freezing, for padding furniture, for dozens of other purposes that a Depression household encountered regularly. A large family might fill a rag bag in a month and never throw out a single usable scrap. Women traded rags with neighbors. Traveling rag and bone men would buy rags by the pound from households. The rags were sold to paper mills that used cotton fiber for paper production. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are still 7 more items ahead, and they only get more remarkable from here. Number 12 is the darning mushroom. Today, when socks get a hole, they go in the trash. During the Depression, they went into the sewing basket alongside a darning mushroom. A darning mushroom was a smooth, egg-shaped or dome-shaped piece of wood, sometimes actual mushroom shape with a handle, sometimes just a ball, that you pushed inside the sock to create a firm surface for weaving new threads across the hole. Darning was a precise skill. You didn't just patch, you wove replacement fabric, thread by thread, mimicking the original weave so closely that a well-darned sock was nearly indistinguishable from an undarned one. Mothers taught daughters. Boys were expected to learn too. A soldier away from home needed to maintain his own gear. The darning mushroom was part of every sewing kit, every hope chest, every trousseau. The nylon sock, which resisted holes better than wool, and the era of cheap, mass-produced clothing together ended darning culture in America. Darning mushrooms now appear in antique shops with small paper tags identifying them, because most people who pick them up have no idea what they're looking at. Number 11 is the rubber gasket jar ring. Home canning was not a hobby during the Depression. It was survival strategy. Families who had gardens canned hundreds of jars per summer. Tomatoes, green beans, corn, peaches, pickles, jams, relishes, apple butter. The seal between a mason jar and its lid depended on a thin rubber ring, the gasket, that compressed under the heat of the canning process to create an airtight seal. These rings were reusable but not infinitely so. They dried out, cracked, lost their elasticity. A failed seal meant a jar of spoiled food, and spoiled food in a Depression household was a small catastrophe. Families inspected every ring before each canning season. They ordered replacements from the Sears catalog. They bought them at the hardware store a dozen at a time. Boxes of unused gasket rings still turn up in estate sales today, tucked in the back of pantry shelves in old farmhouses. The modern canning lid with its built-in sealing compound replaced the separate rubber ring in most American kitchens by the 1960s. The gasket ring is still used by some serious home canners, but the mass culture of treating those small rubber circles as precious household items vanished entirely. Number 10 is the kerosene lamp. Even families who had electricity during the Depression, and many rural families did not, kept kerosene lamps as backup. Electric service was unreliable, bills could go unpaid, and storms regularly knocked out power for days. A kerosene lamp burned cheap fuel available at any hardware store or general store and produced steady, warm, omnidirectional light. Depression households maintained lamps with the same care that modern households maintained smoke detectors. The wick was trimmed regularly to prevent smoking. The reservoir was refilled before it ran low. The glass chimney was cleaned with newspaper because cloth left lint. Children were taught to handle lamps carefully. A dropped kerosene lamp meant fire, and fire in a wood-framed Depression house meant losing everything. There was a specific smell to a kerosene-lit room that every person who grew up in the 1930s can still recall in an instant. Slightly oily, slightly warm, not unpleasant, utterly distinct. When reliable rural electrification spread across America after World War II, kerosene lamps disappeared from active use rapidly. Though many families kept them in closets for decades, a habit of preparedness that never fully died. Number 9 is the button hook. During the Depression, shoes were expensive enough that they lasted for years and were regularly resoled, reheeled, and repaired by hand or by the local cobbler. Many shoes of the era, especially children's shoes and women's ankle boots, fastened with a row of small buttons rather than laces. Getting these buttons through their loops required a button hook, a thin metal shaft with a small hooked tip. You inserted the hook through the loop, caught the button, and pulled it through. A skilled person could button a shoe in under a minute. A child learning for the first time could spend 15 minutes in frustration. Button hooks were made in every price range. Plain iron ones for farm families, sterling silver ones with embossed handles for city households. They were given as gifts, carried in coat pockets, kept in every entryway. The shift to lace-up and slip-on shoes through the 1940s and 1950s made button hooks functionally obsolete. They continued to appear in small numbers as aids for the elderly and for people with limited hand mobility. But the mass culture of the button hook, every family having several, every child learning to use one, vanished completely. Number 8 is the bluing ball. Before optical brighteners were added to laundry detergent, white fabrics washed repeatedly turned yellowish and gray. The solution Depression housewives used was bluing, a small ball or liquid concentrate of ultramarine dye that, paradoxically, made whites look whiter by adding a tiny blue tint that counteracted yellow. A bluing ball was typically a marble-sized compressed powder ball wrapped in thin cloth. You swirled it through the rinse water until the water turned faintly blue, then put the white items through this rinse before hanging them. Too little bluing and whites stayed gray. Too much and you got blue laundry. A common and embarrassing mistake. The bluing ball required judgment born of experience. Grandmothers passed on their exact proportions to daughters. Every laundry day carried the possibility of getting it wrong. Commercial laundry detergents with built-in brighteners made bluing balls obsolete in most American households by the mid-1960s. Mrs. Stewart's liquid bluing still exists for people who want it, but the physical bluing ball, that small cloth-wrapped sphere kept in the laundry basket, has effectively disappeared from American life. Number 7 is the carpet beater. Before electric vacuum cleaners became affordable household items, dust and debris were removed from rugs and carpets by beating. Carpet beaters were typically made of wicker, rattan, or twisted wire, shaped like a large flat paddle or a decorative floral pattern. The design helped create turbulence that shook more dust loose. On designated cleaning days, spring and fall primarily, rugs and carpets were dragged outside, hung over a clothesline or a fence rail, and beaten with vigor. It was hard, dusty, physically exhausting work. Children were sometimes put to work at it. The dust clouds were spectacular. Neighbors could tell who was doing their spring cleaning by the distant sound of carpet beating carrying across the block. There was a social dimension to it. Women might beat carpets at the same time in adjacent yards, talking across the fence while they worked. A house whose rugs were never beaten was a house whose mistress was sick or overwhelmed or had given up. The carpet beater and its use were legible social signals. The affordable electric vacuum cleaner, which arrived in middle-class homes in significant numbers after World War II, made the carpet beater a relic within a single generation. Drop a comment if you remember the sound. We know some of you do. Number 6 is the corn sheller. Rural Depression families who grew corn, which included hundreds of thousands of families who kept small subsistence plots even in poor soil, needed to separate dried corn kernels from the cob before the corn could be ground into meal, fed to chickens, or stored for winter. A hand corn sheller was a simple cast iron device, usually mounted on a board or fitted with a clamp, with a toothed cylinder inside. You inserted an ear of dried corn and turned a handle. The teeth stripped the kernels off the cob cleanly into a bucket, while the cob came out the other end. Shelling corn by hand, literally rubbing the kernels off with your palms, took hours and left your hands raw. The corn sheller reduced that time dramatically and preserved the hands that needed to do countless other tasks. Farm families kept corn shellers as standard equipment alongside the plow and the scythe. They were built to last 50 years, and many did. The industrialization of corn processing and the near-total disappearance of subsistence farming in America ended the home corn sheller's working life. They survive in agricultural museums and in the barns of old farm properties, often still mounted where they were bolted 60 or 70 years ago. Number 5 is the tin ceiling tile. This one isn't quite what you'd expect. Tin ceiling tiles, the embossed metal panels that covered the ceilings of commercial buildings and many urban homes, were a status symbol in the late 19th century. By the Depression, they had become something else entirely, a Depression-era building material for the poor. Families used salvaged tin ceiling tiles to patch holes in walls, to line the inside of root cellars, to create makeshift roofing on lean-to structures and outhouses, to make windbreaks and cold frames for winter gardens. Hardware stores sold them cheaply. Demolition sites gave them away. Families with any carpentry skill used them in ways their Victorian manufacturers never imagined. A tin ceiling tile plugged into a wall cavity stopped wind. Nailed over a broken window, it kept out cold. Layered under a wooden floor over an earthen crawl space, it deterred rodents. The Depression generation understood that a material has as many uses as ingenuity can find for it. The tin ceiling tile was just one example of that principle applied at scale. Number 4 is the ice pick. The ice pick was one of the most common tools in any Depression-era kitchen, and it has almost entirely vanished from modern homes. Its purpose was simple: to chip usable pieces from a larger block of ice. Ice was delivered in large blocks, 25, 50, or 100 pounds, and families needed to break off smaller pieces for drinks, for the ice box, for packing around butter or meat. The ice pick was a heavy wooden handle with a steel spike 6 to 8 inches long. You drove it into the block with short, firm strokes, working along a natural fault line in the ice until it split. It required practice. A clumsy strike sent ice skittering across the kitchen floor. Children who pestered their mothers about the heat in summer were sometimes handed the ice pick as a lesson in the actual physics of cold. Ice picks were kept in kitchen drawers alongside paring knives and bottle openers as a basic implement of daily life. The electric refrigerator with its ice cube trays, and later its automatic ice maker, made the ice pick a specialist tool used only for cocktail preparation in bars. It survives there still, in a small way, but the household ice pick, used every day by every family, is gone. Number 3 is the foot warmer. A foot warmer was a small metal box, typically 6 inches square and 3 inches deep, made of tin or cast iron with a perforated top. You filled it with hot coals from the fireplace or wood stove, closed the lid, and placed it under your feet during long, cold situations. Church services that lasted 2 hours in an unheated building, sleigh rides, buggy rides, long evenings in rooms that couldn't be fully heated. Depression families who couldn't afford enough coal to heat their homes properly used foot warmers at the kitchen table, at the bedside, on the school wagon. Some foot warmers were made to slide under the covers at the foot of a bed, a kind of personal low-tech electric blanket. The metal grew warm enough to be comforting without burning fabric if used carefully. Church pews in rural communities had racks underneath them specifically designed to hold foot warmers during winter services. The foot warmer required tending. The coals needed to be replaced after an hour or two. It was a chore assigned to children, a practical, combustion-based task that 8-year-olds performed as a matter of routine. The heated car, the insulated boot, and the reliable home furnace together made the foot warmer unnecessary. Most families discarded them without a second thought. They are now genuinely rare artifacts. Number 2 is the sad iron. The sad in sad iron comes from an Old English word meaning solid or heavy, and these irons were exactly that. A sad iron was a solid wedge of cast iron, roughly 6 inches long and tapered to a point at one end, weighing between 5 and 9 pounds. You heated it on the stovetop, tested its temperature by spitting on the surface and watching how the droplet behaved, then pressed it across fabric. It cooled as you worked. Most families owned 2 or 3 sad irons, so one could be heating while another was in use. Ironing with a sad iron was a sustained athletic effort. The weight, the heat, the constant motion, the need to return to the stove every few minutes. During summer, ironing day, which was weekly in any household with standards, turned the kitchen into an oven. And yet ironed clothes were not optional. Unironed clothing marked you as someone who had given up, someone without order in their home, someone to be pitied or suspected. Depression families ironed everything: shirts, dresses, sheets, pillowcases, even handkerchiefs. The electric iron, which maintained a constant temperature without heating on a stove, changed ironing from labor to chore. The sad iron became a doorstop, a bookend, a curiosity on a shelf. But for 20 years, it was indispensable. Number 1 on our list is the root cellar. And we want to be precise about what this means. Not the basement of a modern house, not a wine room, not a renovation project. A true Depression-era root cellar was an excavated earthen chamber, usually dug into a hillside or beneath the rear of a house with walls of stone or packed earth, a wooden door set directly into the slope, and a dirt floor that maintained a near-constant temperature of 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of the season outside. This was not accidental. It was the product of site selection, depth, ventilation, and accumulated folk knowledge passed from generation to generation about exactly where and how to dig, so the earth itself would do the work of refrigeration. Inside a properly built root cellar, a Depression family stored everything that kept them alive from September through May. Barrels of apples wrapped individually in newspaper, bins of potatoes and turnips and carrots packed in damp sand, jars of canned tomatoes and green beans stacked floor to ceiling, crocks of salt-packed pork fat, wheels of waxed cheese, braided ropes of onions and garlic hanging from the ceiling joists, dried beans in cotton sacks, maybe a small keg of cider going slowly to vinegar in the corner. The root cellar was not a convenience. It was the difference between a family that ate through winter and a family that did not. Great Depression families who had a good root cellar and a functioning kitchen garden survived years that broke families without them. You didn't go into a root cellar to get a snack. You went in on a November morning and took stock, counted the jars, estimated the potatoes, calculated whether what was there would stretch until the garden came back in May. If the numbers didn't work, you had to make decisions. The root cellar required the kind of long-horizon thinking that has almost entirely vanished from modern American life, replaced by the assumption that the grocery store will always be stocked, the supply chain will never break, and January will not require October planning. Every American who is alive today because their Depression-era ancestors made it through had a root cellar helping to make that possible. They deserve to be remembered. 20 items, 20 windows into a world that was harder, more physical, more precarious, and in some ways more competent than the one we live in now. The people who used these objects every day weren't nostalgic about them. They were too busy surviving to be sentimental. But they knew things that have been largely forgotten. That an object is only obsolete when there's nothing it can do, that something else can't do better. That every material has more uses than it was designed for. That the distance between comfort and catastrophe is shorter than it looks from inside a warm house in a well-stocked year. The question we want to leave you with is this: if the grocery stores went dark tomorrow and the supply chain broke for 6 months, how many of these 20 items would you wish you had? Leave us a number in the comments. And if you remember any of these from your own childhood, or from the stories of grandparents who lived through it, we want to hear every detail you're willing to share. Those memories belong to all of us now. The people who made it through the Depression did so because they knew things about food, about heat, about fabric, about the relationship between human hands and the physical world, that the rest of us are only beginning to understand we've lost.